Hello, everyone. I'm David Yaden, back for another episode of looking at the interface of science and spirituality. Today, I'm here with Dr. Julien Musolino, who's a professor at Rutgers University with a dual appointment in cognitive science and psychology. He's written a great book called The Soul Fallacy, which we'll talk about. We recently attended a conference, which we'll also talk about. But first, I should say that I'm actually in Dr. Musolino's home. I'm downstairs. We thought that we could have our usual chat with some tea across from each other, but our computers started doing feedback like crazy. So I'm downstairs. He's upstairs in his office. Dr. Musolino, hello. Welcome.
Hi, David. It's a pleasure to be with you again. It's a little odd to be on different floors, whereas we could be next to each other. But I'm sure this is going to be a lot of fun, nonetheless.
Looking forward. So we also recently went to a conference together, Common Ground, which was at Rutgers University. It brought together humanists, secularists, people of many different religions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. Mahatma Gandhi's grandson keynoted the event, and Dr. Musolino and I were on a panel about meaning in life. What was your impression of that panel?
But before I give you my impression, please do call me Julian.
Julian.
With friends that know each other, I feel a little odd that that you called me Dr. Musolino. Okay, so now we can talk about. I think overall the conference was a really good idea. Was extremely well organized, and to me was a success. The panel was a lot of fun. That you and I were on, and as you and I have discussed, I was very pleasantly surprised by the quality of the panelists, especially on the sort of other side, if we may put it this way. You and I were more on the sort of secular, agnostic, atheist side, and there were people who were, at least by association or by name, by title, were more on the religious end of the spectrum. And as you and I have talked about, one of them in particular, the Reverend Gaddy, really made a very great impression on me. I mean, it was hard to tell that he was actually on the religious side. On many issues, he thought just like us. So that was overall a really wonderful event. And I think it's really important to be able to talk to one another, to try to understand the other's position, to be friendly about everything. Perhaps the only criticism I would have is that things were a little too friendly, and in the sense of, I mean, it's good to be friendly, but in the sense that people were perhaps a bit shy and afraid to say things that were too strong, aimed at one side or the other.
So at one point, after our panel, which was, I think, billed as an atheist, an agnostic, a reverend, and a rabbi, and right. You were the atheist, I'm the agnostic, and Welton Gaddy was the reverend that you're talking about. I was surprised after our panel. I looked over and saw the two of you having coffee and getting along tremendously well. And you mentioned a few times that you were really impressed by him, and I really enjoyed the panel in general. I thought that each tradition really worked to try to find common ground, which was the point of the conference, on how we can all find meaning in life despite different belief systems. But I'm curious as to your point at the end there, that it may have been too friendly and that people felt inhibited to disagree in a civil way. What would you have brought up that you weren't able to at the event?
Well, so two things I think that come to mind in answer to the question. One of them we started talking about a little bit when issue was brought up about the status of certain beliefs. And I think that, or the fact that certain religious groups would felt shy, or that they were not under attack, but that their ideas were shrinking somehow, that ideas were, or the claims were becoming obsolete. And the point I made is that this is what happens historically. One point was when, insecurity, I think, is the issue that was brought up, that certain claims by people of faith were, there was some insecurity felt about their beliefs and the claims they were making. The rabbi joked that there's plenty of insecurity in the Jewish community, which was fine. But I guess what I was saying, without trying to be a bad person, was that it is in fact historically true that supernatural claims about how aspects of the world work have really shrunk as our understanding of the world, our scientific understanding of the world has progressed. And that's bound to continue to happen. And so to the extent that one ties one's religion, and you and I have talked about the fact that religion is a multifaceted phenomenon, one aspect of which is belief in some supernatural claims or entities. Well, that particular aspect is bound to shrink or continue shrinking. And so if there is insecurity, then yes, that's not surprising. It doesn't mean you have to throw everything out. The dimensions that we discussed about community and the sense of all that's fine. But so I wish we could have talked about this more and seen what either side had to say.
So what basically I think what was raised was that there's a number of different dimensions to religion. There's practices, there's rituals, there's institutions, in addition to there being beliefs. And I think our panel discussed this at some length, is that while some people may disagree with the beliefs, there's plenty of agreement on many of the other dimensions. Meditation was cited as an example of common ground. Because again, we were looking for common ground at the event, where now we can dig into some of these differences. So it sounds like you wish that we were really debating the belief side a little bit more.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, in a way, this is the elephant in the room, right? I mean, this is where, not many people are going to disagree with the fact that it's good to be part of a community, it's good to help each other, it's good to do all the things that we agree we should do. But I think there is friction and tension between, say, naturalism and science on the one hand versus faith on the other, is on the nature of those beliefs which make claims about how the world works. And there was a lot of ground for discussion, and it may have been more difficult to achieve common ground in this case. And this is something that I felt not really touched on very much. Another dimension of this is, although the Reverend did mention a few times that I think he said, well, if I'm live on camera, then I can say that the Republican Party is doing God a disservice, for example. So I wish he could back that further. But there's a link between belief and behavior. If one has certain beliefs, then it's going to lead one to have certain opinions, behave in certain ways, and often these behaviors have been criticized by the more secular side as being potentially troublesome. And so that's something we didn't really talk about much either. So I think overall we talked much about the things that we all agree on, and we agreed that we agree on everything, which was very nice and made us all feel very good. But I think we shied away perhaps as a panel from the more potentially contentious points of friction that may exist between the two worldviews.
Yeah, so on that belief note, to really dig in to the point of contrast, these were theists on the one hand, and you represented the view of non-theism or naturalism. Where do you think spirituality fits into that mix?
Yeah, that's
because this series we're trying to explore the science and spirituality. Dr. Crystal Park was on last time, and we tried to define spirituality. I think we basically failed, but we circled around the topic. And I'm curious, when you hear the word spirituality, what does that mean to you, and how does it tie into these beliefs?
Yeah. So I'm not going to try to define it in 2 minutes. Well, I guess as you and I said, spirituality probably means different things to different people. To the extent that it is linked to those supernatural beliefs, then I think that there's clearly a problem, and there will be conflict between, say, science and spirituality. But it doesn't need to be. If one means something more diffuse and general by spirituality, meaning something like maybe a sense of awe at the beauty and the power of nature, finding something, you often hear people say, well, maybe spirituality is finding something bigger than the self. Well, it doesn't have to be God or souls. It could be mountains and oceans and galaxies and all naturalistic phenomena. So,
and that sounds a lot like self-transcendence or something, you know, the feeling the sense of meaning or self-transcendence, connection to something greater than the self.
Right. So what I'm trying to do as a naturalist, as a non-theist, a non-believer, is sort of understand what it could mean to be spiritual without having beliefs in supernatural entities. So one could ask, is it possible to be spiritual if one also happens to be, say, an atheist or a non-believer? And I think the answer is yes. Now, it may, somebody might insist that to be truly spiritual, you must believe in God or something like that. Well, then so be it. If that's the case, then yeah, we can't be spiritual. But since the meaning of the term seem to be fuzzy, I don't see why one could not be spiritual without having those kinds of supernatural beliefs.
Okay, great. So basically, it sounds like what you're saying is if what you mean by spiritual has something to do with meaning, altruism, self-transcendence, then that's entirely consistent with your worldview and one of naturalism, even potentially. But if what you mean by spirituality has to do with supernatural beliefs, then that's inconsistent with naturalism.
Exactly.
And I know in your book, the soul fallacy, which is great. Do you have it right there? Oh, I thought you were grabbing for it.
Yeah. Hold on, I can.
We'll put a picture of it for people who are interested. But in that book, you talk about. Oh, there it is.
There it is. Yeah.
We'll put a link for people who are interested.
There we go.
Beautifully written, by the way.
Thank you.
You talk about this in supernatural beliefs, that is, in terms of intuitive dualism. Could you say a little bit about what that means?
Right. So I do bring up the issue. Well, maybe we should take a step back and sort of talk about what one means by dualism. And then we qualify and say, what does intuitive dualism mean? What is explicit dualism? As with many terms, dualism is complicated, and there are different varieties of dualism. Perhaps the best known is also called substance dualism or Cartesian dualism. It's the old idea that was by no way invented by Descartes, but can be traced back to Plato and even before Plato, that somehow the mind and the body are separate. They might be joined somehow during your life, but they're separate substances, separate entities. One's material, physical, the other is non-material, non-physical, and they can potentially detach at death, and the mind, consciousness perhaps can continue to function once the body has ceased to function. So that's one kind of dualism. That's substance dualism or Cartesian dualism. There are other minor variations in the literature, but I just want to mention them, but we're not going to talk about them because it's not that they're less interesting, but they're less interesting for our conversation. One is what's called property dualism. It's a philosophical term. It's a kind of monism that says that matter has two kinds of properties, physical and mental. And then there's something called predicate dualism, which is sort of a technical term that is used to describe the state of affairs in cognitive psychology, namely the fact that we work at a level of analysis where we postulate the existence of a mind. Now, what we mean by mind as cognitive psychologists, I think that's important to say, is we simply mean the brain at some level of abstraction. But in the way we talk about things, we're dualists, not in the Cartesian sense, of course, but in the sense of the levels of analysis at which we try to explain certain phenomena. But I think the main object of our discussion is Cartesian or substance dualism, and that's what my book, The Soul Fallacy, is sort of all about.
So, to that point on substance dualism, could you give an example of someone, everyday person on the street, a statement that they might make that would reflect a substance dualist position?
Mm-hmm. Well, they might tell you, for example, that their soul will survive the death of their body, and that when they get to, say, heaven, they will recognize their family members. So that, in other words, their mind will be sort of intact, as it were, and functioning. They'll be able to see and hear and think, but their body will be no longer living. So that's one case. But it's even more interesting than this. Even in our daily usage, we see that we have not altruistic, but dualistic language, hopefully altruistic too. When you say, for example, this is my body, or this is my hand, you're implying that there's the body, and then there's some sort of entity to which or to whom the body belongs. So there's an I or a self that is separate from the physical body. So it shows up in our language too. It also shows up in our experience. If you think about, let's say that I'm trying to grab the cup of tea on my desk here. Subjectively, the impression I have is that at some point there's some kind of conscious intention that pops out of nowhere. It doesn't seem to be caused. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm thirsty now. I want a sip of tea. And so this conscious intention pops up. And it seems to us to have causal powers. In other words, it seems to us subjectively that is what directs our body to grab the cup and say drink. So even in our daily experience, we have this sense that consciousness or the mind is something very different from the body. It's sort of like mysterious, maybe non-material force that has causal powers. So all these things, I think, are linked when we try to understand why people are dualists. And there's a lot of research that you and I have talked about now, experimental research. Paul Bloom, we mentioned Paul Bloom, has written a wonderful book called Descartes' Baby and done some great research trying to show that this seems to be the default position, the default folk or intuitive theories of mind and bodies, that we are naturally inclined as human beings to see the two as separate, made up of different things and separate from one another, and therefore potentially detachable. So, yeah, go ahead. We're going to ask.
Okay. So basically, most people in the world believe in a soul in the sense that their mind is immaterial and in some way interacts with their material body. So most people believe that the mind and the body are separate.
Right. So I think maybe you're right. Now's time to make an interesting distinction between intuitive dualism on the one hand and an explicit dualism. So when psychologists talk about intuitive theories, what they typically mean is that there's a way in which we apprehend the world, and we're equipped with psychological mechanisms to reason about physical objects, or people, or biological entities. And the content of these beliefs is, for the most part, operating below the threshold of consciousness. That's why it's called implicit. It's not explicit. So that's one aspect. So there's evidence, it seems, people have claimed there's evidence that we're implicit dualists. But then there's another dimension to the question, which is that we also happen to be explicit dualists. Meaning when you ask people, do you believe in the soul? Most people will tell you, yes, I do. And in that sense, they have access to the content of their beliefs. They can tell you, well, I think my soul does this or that. I think it has this or that property. So here we have a case where there are good reasons, very good reasons to think that people are implicit dualists, if you look at the research that Bloom and others have done. But there are also very good reasons to think that we're explicit dualists. People will tell you explicitly, even children, that they have a soul and that it has this and that property. So that's an interesting case. The book, The Soul Fallacy, by the way, is for the most part about explicit dualism. And it only mentions implicit dualism in trying to account for where our explicit soul beliefs come from. And I don't know how good a job I do at trying to explain this, but I sort of go over some of the research and the evidence that might explain why we have those explicit beliefs about the soul.
Great. You know, a lot of people, I think, would assume that the belief in an immaterial soul that's in some way separate from the body would be useful for us in some way, and that it would help allay fears of death. It might give us reason to believe that in some way who we are can go beyond our physical death.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some evidence, I talked about it last time with Crystal Park, certain correlations with religious kinds of beliefs like this and different aspects of well-being. But you have a different take, and then you talk about that in your book, and you talk about certain very detrimental aspects to having a belief in dualism or supernaturalism. Can you talk about a few of those, what we might call spirituality or religion and its discontents?
Yeah, certainly. Well, first I want to point out that I'm not the first one to point this out, to point this negative link between certain beliefs and the consequences the negative consequences that they have for us as a society, as a nation, for example. But I guess the general form of the argument goes something like this. If you want to make good decisions that don't just affect you but other people, whether it be policy decisions, ethical decisions, moral decisions, it's really good to try to anchor them in as clear and as good an understanding of the world as possible. To give a quick example, in medieval times during the Great Plague, we had the wrong theory, the wrong beliefs about what caused disease. So it was the wrath of God theory of disease. People thought that the plague was unleashed upon them because God was angry. And so those beliefs had consequences for what people would do. They would very often cut off tongues and sew lips shut so that people would not blaspheme and offend God further. Now, if you truly believe that God is responsible for unleashing the plague and that people who blaspheme anger God, then doing those terrible things is a perfectly rational approach. But notice it's anchored in the wrong theory of how the world works. And of course, people who are subjected to that suffer. If you replace the theory by the germ theory of disease, now that suffering loses its raison d'être, as we say in French, right? And so in a less dramatic fashion, I think this is what's happening with dualism. Science tells us that dualism of the Cartesian type is most likely false. And so
can you talk a little bit about that? Why does science tell us that dualism in this way is most likely false?
Right. Notice that I say most likely. I could be more assertive, but well, I guess the first thing to say, which is important, it's important because I've noticed that when you tell people that the soul is a scientific question, the first reaction you get is, no, it's not. It's a religious notion. It's a metaphysical notion. It has nothing to do with science. Science has nothing to say about this. I think that's a big mistake. I think that you ought to first look at the nature of the claim and the belief, and then you can decide whether science has something to say about it or not. In the case of the soul, the kind of soul that most people believe in, you don't need to think too far to realize that those beliefs are, I see you have company there.
Here's Muffin, your cat.
She'll be fine.
She gets a cameo.
She'll leave you alone. Yeah, she wanted to. Well, Descartes thought that she didn't have a soul, so I think it's appropriate for her to show up at this point. But to summarize briefly the research on explicit soul beliefs, most people, by no means all, believe that human beings have a soul that has three properties. It's claimed to be immaterial or non-physical, so separate, distinct from the body. It's claimed to be psychologically potent, So it somehow contributes to our psychological functioning, gives us a moral compass, free will, consciousness, feelings, personality. And finally, it's detachable from the body. At death, the body ceases to function, but the soul continues to function and carries our consciousness into the afterlife. Well, you see, once you have a good notion or definition of what people take the soul to be, you can ask, well, is that a scientific claim? And the answer is a resounding yes. If you're claiming that the mind can actually operate outside the bounds of the physical body, it makes very clear testable predictions. And in other words, there could be evidence that the world works that way. So I'll give you a couple of lines of evidence that would support these conclusions if that evidence was available. It's not, but people who undergo near-death experiences or often accompanied by out-of-body experiences very often interpret those mystically or religiously and will tell you that, so for the viewers or listeners who are not aware of the phenomenon, what you experience subjectively is seeing yourself, seeing your body from a third-person perspective. It's as though your mind or soul had detached temporarily from your body, and you could see yourself. And the real you, the soul, is sort of floating around the room nearby and supposedly can hear and see everything. So there you have, it's consistent with this notion that the soul and the body are detachable. Now, people have done, so this leads to a very clear prediction. If your soul / mind / self can actually see and hear everything, because it's floating around the room and your body has a much more restricted vantage point, what if we were to place a laptop computer on top of a closet, displaying certain kinds of information? And what if upon regaining consciousness, the person would tell you, oh yeah, I was floating about the room, my soul could see everything, and by the way, here's precisely what was on that laptop that my physical body could not possibly have seen, given its more restricted vantage point. Well, if we had such evidence, if the evidence was replicated, if it came from different labs, and et cetera, that would be really good evidence that the mind can operate outside the confines of the body. So in principle, you could verify the claim that the mind / soul and body are detachable. There is no such serious evidence.
So parapsychology has an absolutely terrible track record of really proving just about anything associated with the paranormal or the parapsychological. Now, some might say, though, that there are some claims that are outside of the domain of science insofar as they're unfalsifiable and that there would be no way to test whether or not they're true.
That's true. But it's not, in the case of the soul that most people believe in, it's certainly not one of those claims. I mean, the nature of the belief itself is clearly such that it's a perfectly clear and empirical hypothesis about the nature and functioning of the human mind and its relationship to the human body.
Interesting. So let me ask you this. So for some people who do make that leap of faith and have explicit soul beliefs, what are some policy positions?
Right.
In your book, I know you talk about retributive justice.
Yes.
And that these beliefs actually change people's behavior and their decision-making process in sometimes detrimental ways. I'm interested if you could talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy you want to talk about the justice case, yes?
Yeah.
Because it's a little...
So you wrote about this in your book. I think it's really interesting. I haven't seen it elsewhere.
Yeah, I wrote about some 2 or 3 cases, perhaps the most interesting and perhaps the case that people have heard the least about is the case of our how we apprehend, how we think about justice. So the argument's a little complicated, so I'll try to unpack it for you. Well, we can begin by thinking about, so it's basically a connection between what kind of notion of free will we have, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, how this impacts our notion of moral responsibility and human agency. Now, it turns out that soul beliefs, in this case, either explicit or implicit, are linked to the kind of free will that people think that we have. So let me talk about this first, and then I'll put the argument together. There's a kind of free will in the philosophical literature called either libertarian free will, which has nothing to do with the political philosophy, or sometimes called a contra-causal free will. So the claim is that when you do things, you can will to do something, right? So if you ask a person who believes in contra-causal free will and ask her, well, why did you do that? Why did you move your arm this way or make this decision? Well, they would answer, my will caused me to do that. Now, if you ask that person, what caused your will to do that? The answer is nothing. So the claim about libertarian free will or contra-causal free will is that our will has causal powers. It can make us do things, but it itself is uncaused by anything whatsoever, unconstrained by the laws of nature, physics, uncaused. So in that view, in that sense, we would be prime movers or uncaused causes. Okay, and there are people who claim that only if you have that kind of free will can you truly be held morally accountable for the things that you do. So that's contra-causal free will. Now, how is this connected to the soul? Well, we know that people, the decisions we make, the actions that we undertake are caused by quite a few things. The kind of genes that we have, our experiences, our desires, the chemistry of our brain, the state of the universe, et cetera, et cetera. All these are causal forces. But the idea is, well, ultimately, the soul, which is immaterial, non-physical, is what causes us to do what we do, especially in, say, moral domain, for example. And the nice thing about this view is that the soul is precisely what you need. It is the ultimate uncaused cause. It has causal powers. Remember, Descartes believed that it operated through the pineal gland and could somehow trigger the animal spirits. So the soul has causal powers, but it itself, being immaterial, not being subjected to the laws of physics, is uncaused. So here we have our uncaused cause, right? So that's how soul beliefs link to a particular view of free will. Okay, that's the first part of the argument. Now we can think about why is it that and it's linked, of course, to moral responsibility, right? The claim of many people theologians or philosophers who believe is that without contra-causal free will, there can be no responsibility. How do we think about justice and punishment? Why do we punish people when they do bad things? So there are two sort of historical reasons why we do that. One is forward-looking. It's called consequentialism, right? Somebody did something terrible, and let's say they're a rapist, and what we say is, look, we want to contain such individuals because we can't undo what they did. They raped someone, it's a horrible crime, but we can't undo that. But we have to make sure that it doesn't happen in the future. And so we punish these individuals by somehow containing them. We put them in jail or something like that, so that down the road they're not going to repeat the offense. Now, there are people who say, look, this really misses the point. Consequentialism really misses the point. You want to punish people, not only because you don't want them to do bad things again, but because they deserve to be punished. Okay, so now it's looking at another approach to justice, which is retributivism, based on the notion of retribution. So it's backward looking. You look back at the origin of the action, and you say, look, that person had a choice. They could have done otherwise than they did, but they didn't. And so they deserve to be punished. Okay. So now the link between free will and these two notions. So by the way, there's a fantastic paper I want to plug on this issue. It's a paper by Joshua Green at Harvard. It's maybe a decade or so old. And his former mentor, I think, I don't remember the first name. Jonathan Cohen, thank you, right? The paper, so yeah, you know the paper. The paper is called "For the Law, Neuroscience Changes Everything and Nothing." So the argument I'm giving you is beautifully described in that paper. Okay, so if viewers or listeners want to sort of get back the details. So now, how do we connect these two notions of justice and punishment, two notions of free will? Well, it turns out that for a consequentialist, it doesn't really matter whether our will is cause or uncaused. It's irrelevant because the action is done, and what we care about is what happens down the road in the future. And so consequentialism in this big argument is compatible with different resolutions of the free will problem. On the other hand, the claim is that if you want to be a retributivist, then you have a much narrower spectrum of positions. You must basically believe in countercausal free will. Because you have to look back and say, well, at the time at which you committed the action, you could have done otherwise. So one of the hallmarks of libertarian free will is basically the idea of being able to do otherwise. So given a particular set of circumstances, if you were to go back in time and put the person in exactly the same state, everything else is the same, could they have chosen to do otherwise? Our intuitions say, well, yes. But if you say yes, then you don't believe in causation. You believe in some weird countercausal notion. So the claim then is that if, in fact, countercausal free will and the soul are scientifically dubious, then it sort of pulls the rug from under retribution. It makes no more sense now to be retributive because the theory of human agency upon which it rests is simply not valid scientifically. So that's the argument. Now, if this goes through, right, it's very nice because it says, look, science can now inform our moral decisions in an interesting way by saying that some moral decisions are based on a worldview that is not scientifically accurate, and so we should change them. And I think it's all the more important to be aware of this in a country like the United States, because we have a really dysfunctional criminal justice system. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Recently, even President Obama sort of tried to address the issue. I think it's something like 700 and something inmates per 100,000 people in the country. It's out of bounds with the rest of the developed world. We have a very harsh system, which is very punitive. We still have the death penalty. So I think the argument takes even more importance in the kind of society in which we live. So that's sort of one of the. But you see, it takes about 10, 15 minutes to actually explain. It's not.
So let me just break that down for a second.
Sure.
So basically, judges who have soul beliefs or supernatural beliefs, substance dualistic beliefs, as you describe it, are more likely to believe in this notion of libertarian free will, and therefore will be more likely to advocate for harsher punishments. They'll be more interested in retribution or punishment than rehabilitation, for instance.
Right. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Is that an accurate characterization of the argument?
Somewhat. So it may not just be judges in this case.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Judges might want to be harsh on crime for selfish personal reasons. Maybe they're going to run for office and they want to be perceived as tough on crime or what have you. The second thing is that in this case, I don't think that it's the explicit beliefs that matter, although they might. When you ask people, I'll tell you about this in a minute, when you ask people for justification. But I think in this case that the intuition matters. It seems about people being able to do otherwise. So I've done this in my classes very often. So I ask students, I say, well, okay, so somebody is about to pull the trigger. They're robbing a convenience store because they want money, and the clerk fights, and then the guy's holding a gun. At some point, he pulls the trigger. And you say, well, suppose that so that's one decision he made. He made the decision to pull the trigger. If we were to go back in time now to the point at which he was about to pull the trigger, and everything else is exactly the same, the universe is in the same state, everything is the same, could the person have chosen to do otherwise? The intuition is yes, but that's most likely mistaken. If we are fully caused, if we're part of the causal nexus, if we are material creatures, then we're fully caused. And consciousness is simply something else that is caused. And there's pretty good reasons to think that consciousness itself, or at least the subjective feeling of consciousness, itself has no causal powers. There's really good research on this, by the way. But so if that's the case, then the intuition that says, well, he could have done otherwise, and somehow chose to not do so, and therefore he deserves to be punished. Well, his choice itself was caused. You see, and that's the point. Everything is caused, and so I use an analogy maybe to clarify all this. If we have a bit of time, I'm happy to run it by you. Just let me know what you think.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you could basically encapsulate this
Sure.
For the listeners, I think that would be really great.
Okay. So this is something I wrote about in the book. So suppose that there's a big boulder that sits on top of the hill, and it's been there for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and it's slowly losing its grip because of climate change, because of erosion, because of the weather. And at the bottom of the hill, there's a village with a few dozen homes. Well, one night, a particularly violent storm pushes the boulder over the edge. It comes crashing down the hill, flattens a few homes, kills a few dozen people. Okay. So suppose now you ask, was the boulder causally responsible for the death of the people? The answer is clearly yes. That's the boulder that did it. Right? Okay. Now suppose you ask, could the boulder have done otherwise? Well, people will tell you no. The boulder was subjected to forces over which it had no control. It did the only thing it could do. Subjected to gravity and the wind and the rain, it did the only thing that it could do. Okay, good. That's not very hard. Now, suppose that we gave that boulder one additional property, a human-like property. We said it's just a boulder in all the respects, but we give it the capacity to suffer, very much like we suffer, human beings. Okay, so now suppose you ask people, would it make sense, because the boulder crashed and killed all these people, to purposely make it suffer by setting it on fire? It would be silly to make it suffer. What you might want to do is, are you still there, by the way?
Yeah.
David? Oh, okay, you froze for a second. People will tell you it would be silly to make it suffer. It did the only thing it could do. What would be interesting is if there are other boulders around in a similar situation, you want to contain them. But to make it suffer for something that it did when it was fully caused would be silly. So now transpose the analogy to people. You take the young guy who's robbing a convenience store and pulls the trigger. Now, if you ask, could he have done otherwise? People have intuitions. They say yes. But in fact, if we are fully caused, then we're no different from the boulder in the sense that we're fully caused. We're part of the causal nexus. We, like the boulder, are fully caused. And so now, of course, people will tell you, wow, here's a huge problem. If you say this, then how could we have moral responsibility then? If both the boulder and the young man are fully caused. I think asking the question that way is a mistake. Who's to say that the relevant criterion for deciding moral responsibility is whether or not something is fully caused? In other words, can we think of another variable that distinguishes between, say, people and boulders, such that we want to pin moral responsibility to that and not to whether or not you're fully caused? And the answer is yes. Human beings have a broad sense of reason or rationality that boulders, so we think, don't have. And that's what you want to anchor. In fact, that's what the law cares about for purposes of ascribing moral responsibility. It doesn't care whether or not you're fully caused or whether contra-causal free will is true. So now, if to finish the argument, if we are like the boulder in the sense that we're fully caused, then it makes as little sense to want to make someone suffer gratuitously to punish them as it would to make the boulder suffer. So that's sort of that's the argument, but it's very counterintuitive.
Yeah. So there's sort of substance dualism, soul beliefs by way of libertarian free will leads to, in some cases, a tendency towards retributive justice, wanting to punish for the sake of punishment. That's really fascinating.
Yeah,
thank you for leading us through that argument.
Again, it's not my argument. I don't want to take responsibility for it. I'm just giving you a version of an argument that I find too, like you, extremely interesting.
Of course.
if it turns out to be true,
Yes.
yeah.
Now, we just have a couple minutes left, and in your book, you uh, sort of end on an up note, and you suggest that there are secular sources of meaning, that having a naturalistic worldview can in fact imbue our lives with meaning, albeit through different pathways than the theistic route. Can you talk about just a couple of those very briefly?
What I'm saying in the book is, I must confess, not very deep at all. But again, I think the point has to be made for a general audience, because not that you have to say things that are shallow to a general audience, but because, as you know from the panel in which we sat together a few weeks ago, there's this pervasive idea in our society that unless we believe in God and the survival of the self after death, then we can't possibly have true meaning in life. I think that's just transparently false, and it's odious in a way. So all I'm saying in the book, really, and I'm saying a few more things, but what I'm saying is that there are plenty of things in life that bring meaning to people, have brought meaning to people for a long, long time. Anything that, like love and family and friendship, et cetera, it could be a very long list. So I think that given this list of things that we know has brought and continues to bring meaning and purpose to people, I don't see the need personally to add a couple of invisible friends to the list to make my life meaningful. Now, if people wanted that, that's fine, as long as it doesn't have too many adverse consequences for the rest of us. But so that's sort of what I end up saying in the book, and I end up showing, perhaps more importantly, that the naturalistic or the scientific image of personhood does not lead to despair, is not bleak. In fact, we should embrace it. And it sort of centers around the notion of death, because the book is about the soul and the possibility of an afterlife. So one idea is that if we push the naturalistic line of reasoning, which claims that our mental lives, including our conscious thoughts, arise from the operation of our body and brain, then when the body and brain cease to function, we don't have any more consciousness or thoughts or anything like that. And so that means that we should all worry, I suppose, about dying, because dying is not a very happy prospect, but we should not worry about being dead. The state of being dead is the last thing in the world we should worry about, because if this view is correct, then there is nothing it is like to be dead. And so it's not like we are in a dark, lonely, isolated place, missing everybody if you're not, say, in heaven. The question doesn't arise. Just like it doesn't arise before we were born. And before we were born, we simply didn't exist. We didn't have thoughts or consciousness. So that's a very positive implication. The other one is, I think that by asserting that we are mortal, in fact, that we're not immortal, but at least we're naturally mortal. I'm saying naturally because down the road we might find ways to become artificially immortal, just like we found ways to fly artificially or to
Well, that's a topic of another show. I'll have to have you come back on and talk about naturalistic immortality.
Yeah, I might not be the right person to talk to, but so if we are naturally mortal, it means that our lives are finite. And with finitude comes meaning. Resources that are rare and finite are more precious in some sense. And so I think this is good. We should embrace life because it's precious, it's finite, it's the only one we have. And I think this is wonderful. So the scientific worldview, and in particular the view that we're not immortal, is often depicted by its detractors as terrible and dark and bleak. It doesn't take much thinking to realize that this simply isn't the case. I think that's a good thing, because you can actually have both truth and happiness at the same time. Finding the truth about how we really are and our true nature doesn't mean that we have to give up happiness. And I think that's a wonderful conclusion.
Great words to end on. Julien, thanks so much. Really enjoyed talking to you, and we'll put a link for your book, The Soul Fallacy. Thanks again.
It was a pleasure, David. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.